Hello, everyone. My name is Joy Mikhail. I'm the Senior Program Officer with Refugee Welcome Collective. I want to first welcome you to our Refugee Welcome Collective monthly webinars. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information. Our monthly webinars, our social learning spaces, are meant to be an opportunity for you as staff at the local and the national levels to share practices, resources, challenges, and lessons learned in the field. We hope that you enjoy today's webinar, Navigating LGBTQIA+ Refugee Support. Just a little bit about us. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to provide quality community sponsorship programs around the United States. Just for housekeeping, as a reminder for everyone who's joining us today, everyone on today's webinar is going to be automatically muted. However, there will be a time at the end of our webinar for Q&A. Also, feel free to engage with our speaker. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to drop it in the chat. Also, if you have any technical issues, please post your question in the chat and we will be able to assist you. Additionally, any resources and a recording of today's webinar is going to be sent out to everyone following today's webinar. And that brings us to our presenter for today, who I have the pleasure to have with me today, Roxandra Marco, who is the Director of Programs with Refugee and Immigrant Voices in Action. Roxandra, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and inviting me to speak on this topic. That means a lot to me. So yeah, we'll just get started and I will keep an eye on the chat, but also Joy and Grace, if you see questions come my way, please feel free to let me know. To start, I will just provide a brief overview for what you can expect from this next 50 minutes together or hour together. I will introduce myself to you and then start off with some terminology and language, some common language for us to have. And then look more broadly at LGBT refugees, what makes them unique from maybe other refugees that we work with or support or are, and what are some takeaways in terms of best practices. I will talk a little bit about survivor-led support and care, and I will look at the time. I want to make sure we have some time at the end in case you have very specific questions or things that I didn't get to talk about. We can discuss those during the Q&A session. And a note on also just the way I structured my slides, you'll see that every slide has a QR code on it because this is such a big topic and LGBTQIA refugees are not a monolith. We're a very broad, diverse group of people with many, many, many backgrounds and experiences and diverse identities within the LGBT spectrum, on top of having different cultural and ethnic belief systems and experiences. So there's no way I could provide enough information in this hour today. So what I tried to do is give you just a broad intro. And then if anyone wants to dig deeper into a specific topic, everything I touch on today, you can either scan the QR code while I'm talking and pull it up on your phone, or you can follow the link that's on every slide once you receive the slide deck after my talk. And you can also follow up with me if you have any specific questions. So please treat this as an intro, as a jump into this topic, but by no means a comprehensive talk on the experiences of LGBTQI refugees and displaced people. So who am I talking to you about this today? Roxandra Marco is my name. I use she and they pronouns. I also go by Sandra. I come to this topic both from personal experience, lived experience and knowledge as a displaced person. I was a refugee originally from Romania. We left shortly after the revolution. I was resettled with my family as a child in Germany, then Canada, and then I came to the US as an immigrant on a green card. And I identify as the L in the LGBT. I'm a lesbian. I'm a mom. I'm married to my wife. I'm a daughter of Romanian parents. So there's also a lot of cultural friction there between the way they were raised to think about LGBT people and the way I feel about it. And so it's that lived experience, and then additionally my professional research and knowledge on this topic that informs this talk. I spent 15 years in higher education and academia. I researched gender, race, and the construction of national identity is my sort of primary areas of focus. Later, I got more into just understanding marginalization and poverty and food insecurity, especially within a US context. I spent 4 years, the past 4 years, also providing consulting services within DEI and as an educator. I love nonprofits, and I'm now in a nonprofit with Riva, Director of Programs with Refugee and Immigrant Voices in Action. It's a Des Moines-based, Iowa-based organization. And so my work with marginalized people, my own lived experience, and then my identity is what informs this talk. And yeah, and I welcome you, whether you're here because you're part of the community, if you're here just because you want to learn more, if you have some experience, no experience with this topic, or a whole lot of experience. Either way, I hope you'll chime in the chat and yeah, make this engaging for all of us. So to start, I thought it would be good for those of you with maybe less experience with LGBTQIA identities to talk about language and why it matters, why it's good to push yourself to learn the different acronyms or the different words that we use. Mainly because using the right language shows respect, right? And I think within resettlement and working with people of all different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, we talk a lot about having cultural humility, right? And understanding that it's good to show respect, to make an effort to meet someone where they're at, not just expect them to assimilate to your culture. And I would say that that's very analogous to how I think I would describe the LGBT community and making an effort to learn the terminology, to understand the language, to call someone by the term they want to be called. And for ourselves within the community, having the language to describe who we are is just a way of making meaning of our experience, and it's really powerful. And so when people talk about like, there are just so many words and the LGBT is just so long, yes, it is, but also we're all very diverse people, and having language that can describe each one of us as best as possible is also just is a way of finding worth and value in our identity. There's a really great website from Amnesty International that's called Gender Identity for Beginners that the slide will take you to. Next slide. Here are just some of the terms that you might encounter and that you might hear me reference today. And because we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to go into each one and what they mean, but just again, you can follow the website link and look into this some more, but some common key terms you'll hear is gender, sex, gender identity, gender presentation, agender, non-binary, cisgender, intersex, and transgender. I do want to point out, so gender identity is how someone identifies about themselves, right? How I feel about who I am. Presentation has more to do with appearance and how others see you. And we know that we make assumptions and we ascribe identity based on what we see, right? So if someone's the way they feel about them and the way the world reads them and talks to them and about them is one and the same or pretty well aligned, that's the person who we say is cisgender, right? So someone who is maybe assigned a sex at birth and the way they feel about themselves and the way the world perceives them, all is pretty well aligned. Whereas transgender is the experience of being assigned sex and gender, of being pronounced or talked to in a certain way that's completely misaligned with how you feel about yourself. So you're transgender. Agender might be the experience of feeling dissonance or feeling not aligned with any of the genders ascribed to you, and so forth. On the right-hand side, we have heterosexual, or what we'll say straight, right, colloquially, queer, gay, lesbian, ally, questioning. One thing that happens often is that people conflate the two and they think it's all the same. But I wanted to point out that the column on the left is about gender, which is, Do I feel like I'm feminine or masculine or a boy or a girl or neither or both? Versus the other column is who I'm attracted to, right? Who am I attracted to? So you could be a non-binary lesbian. Like, I'm not really sure about my gender identity, but I know I'm attracted to women, right? Would be an example. Or I was assigned male at birth. I identify as male. When people say sir or he or Mr., totally fine. That corresponds to how I understand myself. And I'm attracted to men. So I'm a cisgender gay man, right? So one is identity, gender identity. One is attraction. I point this out because attraction can be in some ways easier to hide, right? So if you have the privilege of looking cisgender and not trans, you might not feel like you're in danger in certain countries and communities where looking outside of what's prescribed can be a red flag, can put you in a place of being a target. Attraction is different, right? We can say we can hide it, we can't, but they're different things. And someone who experiences oppression in both of these columns is going to be in a much more dangerous place than someone who maybe is just experiencing one or the other, and so forth. So next slide. I also wanted to link to this when you get the slides. This is a guide with language translated in multiple languages, English, French, Turkish, Farsi, and Arabic. It was really interesting because sometimes I wonder, do we even have an Arabic equivalent to non-binary, right? Like, some of these languages come very much from an American and Western context. And so it's hard sometimes when we're also talking across culture and language to know, can we even describe this in the same way? I think this guide is a good start. I will say trigger warning. If you look at it, they also include terminology that I would think is really offensive, really derogatory, and it's just all intermixed all together. And so that's my issue with this guide, that it doesn't make a clear distinction for someone who might not know that some of these terms you really shouldn't use. You should know what they are, but please don't use them. But it's there as a guide and a resource. Okay. I will not spend too much time on pronouns today because this is very much within an English context, something we talk about, but I just wanted to, again, give you a guide on it. This is, again, one of those things when we're talking cross-cultural communication, I'm not sure how well it translates to other languages, but in an English-speaking context, I'm sure you have encountered the fact that some people use pronouns outside of he, him, or she, her. They, them being probably the third most frequently used outside of the binary for folks who feel like they're genderqueer, maybe feel like they're fluid on the spectrum of male, female, masculine, feminine. It's also a really nice thing to be comfortable using they, them, because I always defer to using that until I know how someone self-describes or what pronouns they prefer. I try not to assign that based on my observation. I like to have people tell me how they like to be described, and they, them is sort of a neutral pronoun that I use until someone has told me otherwise. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about pronouns outside of the binary, there's a really fantastic guide linked here. Okay. So now we're getting into really the heart of our topic today, which is, why do we even need to think about LGBTQIA refugees as a separate group unique from just refugees, right? We want to help everyone. And that's absolutely the case. However, we also know that certain people, individuals experience oppressions based on who they are, uniquely due to that factor or differently from others. And so to really be responsive in our support and care services, it's good to have at least an awareness and understanding of some of the issues impacting some. And we do this when we're talking about gender-specific support services, displaced people with disabilities or health issues. And so this, I would say, is part of that awareness raising around certain individuals and populations who have additional oppressions that they're contending with. This information on this slide comes from Human Rights Watch. Again, you can access it with the link or the URL or the QR code. A recent assessment showed that over 70 countries currently restrict LGBTQIA people in some way. Restriction can be anything from outlawing same-sex marriage or having medical coverage from your partner if you're a same-sex couple. Adoption often falls under the same-sex couples that cannot adopt, or even single people, if they are outed as homosexual, may not be given adoption rights. There is a difference between restriction and criminalization. So over 70 countries restrict. Within that, there are many countries that criminalize, which criminalization means not only are we limiting rights, but it's punishable in some way. And on the right there, you see that laws that criminalize same-sex relations, and you can look at these interactive maps, and there are many of them on the Human Rights Watch page if you want to follow up on this. That criminalization can be anything from a prison sentence of several years to a life sentence to an immediate death penalty to corporal punishment, or unspecified sentence, which then you're basically at the whim of whoever's deciding in that moment, right? It's not legalized or regulated anyway. So total human rights violations. The scary thing for a lot of us who are queer and come from communities that are deeply homophobic is that there's the law, but then there's also popular belief and cultural belief. And especially for many of us who come from nations that are very much influenced by faith-based belief systems, right? Or religious belief systems that will equate being gay with demonic or unnatural or animalistic. There's a deep fear that you're always being surveilled by your neighbors, by maybe even other family members, by people in your very community, right? So when we talk about laws and not breaking the law in maybe a different context, maybe we're just thinking, oh, I just don't want authority to find out, right? Like I might have done something that I know is illegal, and as long as no one in a position of authority finds out, I'm okay. I think when it comes to being queer in a place where it's just not safe to be queer, it's not just the police or the authority. It's also like, will my neighbor see the person coming and going and report me? Will my uncle, will somebody else do it? So there's also a lot of surveillance and that inconsistent application of repercussions that puts you in a place of constant fear and anxiety, right? And there's also a lot of pain that comes from experiencing family and community level betrayal, not just government betrayal. And so with refugees in general, I think many of us are displaced people because we've experienced government betrayal. And now you're also adding family and community level betrayal. So a lot of trauma. So trauma awareness is important and good to have. Next slide. This information comes from Rainbow Railroad, which is a fantastic organization. If you haven't heard of it, they are in the US and Canada, but also have locations throughout the world. Find them here. The next several slides pull from their latest report published in 2022. So this information is 2 years old, but I think it's still pretty accurate. It's really interesting because they look at refugees who self-identify as LGBT, as queer, who are seeking them out specifically because of that identity for help. So they are able to tell us, like, in terms of queer refugees, which, if you know, with a lot of resettlement agencies, we don't collect that data. We don't necessarily ask someone to self-disclose. So it's harder to have accurate data around who we're seeing and who we're helping. Because their organization supports LGBT refugees specifically, they can also shed some light on who's coming from where. I'll pause because I see there's a question on terminology. Okay, so just a really brief interlude on terminology, because you've probably heard me say both LGBT and queer. And the question is around the term queer and whether that's seen as offensive to some folks. And yes, I think with every term, somebody might find it like either offensive or just not, it doesn't resonate with me. I use queer, so you'll hear me say it just on autopilot because I identify with that term, but queer used to be used as a slur. So I think generationally older LGBT folks might not like it, use it. I hope it doesn't bother anyone. I can try to just say LGBT, which is the acronym for lesbian, gay, bi, trans, have to have it in front of me, intersex, allied, or asexual, ace, yeah. So in terms of broadly speaking, LGBT refugees coming to the US and Canada, in the last couple of years, the top countries where requests were being made from were Afghanistan, Pakistan, but within Pakistan, 70+% of those making requests were actually displaced Afghans. So we know that a lot of Afghans right now have been going to Pakistan as a way out of the country. So Afghanistan, Pakistan, because the Taliban, Turkey, Uganda, which is another country that has just in the last few years put in some really, really severe criminalizations of same-sex relations laws, Jamaica, Russia, Jordan, United States, and here I think we're seeing second, like, what is that called? Second entry, right? A re-entry. So they're not American born, but rather people who have come to the US and are still needing support, Nigeria and Kenya. Top 10 nationalities of people requesting support due to their LGBT identity: Afghanistan, Uganda, Russia, Syria, Pakistan, Jamaica, Nigeria, Iran, Jordan, Egypt. I think it's important to also show this because we need to dispel any sort of myth that LGBT people only exist in the West or in certain countries, or that there are no gay Afghans, there are no lesbian Syrians. Not true. You can be Muslim and lesbian, you can be Muslim and transgender, you can be from anywhere in the world and hold these identities. How safe you feel to disclose it is a separate issue, but we exist everywhere. Next slide. So Rainbow Railroad tracks the following 16 health and welfare concerns. And I show this list because I think this is actually something that we look for in any sort of support service role working with displaced people generally, right? We're wanting to know, are there chronic diseases that are impacting welfare? Disability? Is someone pregnant, right? Is there a risk of suicide or self-harm? What sort of housing needs are there, etc. Next slide. When it comes to specifically the LGBT refugee population, here are an additional 34 safety concerns that need to be taken into account due to the experiences that LGBT refugees and displaced people have faced, right? And so these are hard, and I hope, you know, no one is triggered as I'm reading these. Acid attacks, right? Arson on home or business, community rejection and violence, conversion therapy, right? This idea that there's a sort of therapy out there that can change someone from being lesbian or gay or trans to being straight, heterosexual, etc. Religious persecution, threat of forced marriage. Forced marriage is also often used in many cultures to force an identity on someone. Yeah, human trafficking, sex work. LGBT people are represented much higher in these communities because there's exploitation that can happen, especially when it's used to blackmail or coerce someone into an action. Because if not, you have this information about them that if you share it, they will be at greater harm. So now you can use that information to blackmail or to coerce someone to doing something they don't want to do, right? So there are many, many safety concerns. And I say this because if you're working with someone who is recently resettled and they're coming from a place where maybe they experienced some or any of this, I would not advise asking someone, but I would advise having an awareness and a recognition that this trauma is likely there. Obviously, no one owes you their story. No one owes any of us their story, but that awareness and understanding that when someone has a hard time opening up or trusting or developing relationships, it very well is due to this trauma. that might have been experienced. And I think now is also maybe a good moment to note, because these traumas come from fellow, like in community trauma, right? In community violence that can happen. I think often we think that when, say we're helping like a newly arrived Afghan person in the US, and we think, oh, I must connect them to the Afghan community locally. I know of one, I know of a community, I know an organization, let me make that introduction. I think that is helpful in general, but when we're helping people who have experienced abuse at the hands of people in their own family or community, that might not represent a safe space. What might be much more helpful is to connect someone who, if they share that they're LGBT, if they share that and disclose that, my number one go-to connection would be with an LGBT community locally. So if someone tells me that they identify as any part on that LGBT spectrum, before I even connect them culturally, I will connect them with someone with an LGBT group, because that's access and representation they have not had. And that is a place where, you know, there might be language barriers and cultural barriers, but it feeds a part of your identity that hasn't been fed up till this point, most likely. Okay, moving on to the next slide. And if there are other questions or comments, please place them in the chat. So the highest, the like top reported safety concerns from LGBT refugees, community rejection, right? What we were just talking about, and family-based rejection. These are the top safety concerns listed. And here, let me look at the chat real quick. So the question is, these safety concerns are making me think about mental health needs for survivors. Can you comment on those needs and resources for mental health support? And then whether I know of experiences of LGBT folks in Valenzuela. And also another one about the terminology SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity. You know what? Okay, let me pause on this slide while you look at this info here and address some of these questions. SOGI, I actually wasn't familiar with that term until I started working within resettlement. I only ever knew LGBT and other terminology, and then encountered SOGI. So maybe different, like humanitarian sector, nonprofit world versus academic setting, academic terminology differences. I don't know if one's outdated. I can't comment. It's, yeah. I don't know without doing further research about specifics in Venezuela at the moment. And so I would need to look into that. And I think this is where just Googling the country specifically and its laws or information on it will yield very specific results. And then in terms of mental health, that could be like several sessions on its own, right? LGBT folks have some of the highest mental health, I don't know what needs, struggles reported across different demographics, and the suicidality rate of LGBT youth in the US, which is not just displaced youth, but also American born. This is their home country and culture, but the suicidality rate is much higher than that of their peers. And so mental health should always be at the top of the considerations when thinking about support services. I'll talk at the end of this talk a little bit about survivor-led care. That might be a good entry into that. Okay, next slide. I just pulled this quote because I just thought this was like a beautiful illustration of what we're talking about. This is from someone from Turkey who is helped by Rainbow Railroad. To me, safety is surrounding, to be able to sleep without fear, go out without fear here. After we claimed asylum and were sent to an open camp, we did not feel safe at all. It is horrible for LGBTQI community at the camps. We felt all the staring and judgment. We were not safe at all. We changed camps, and finally we're here with a host family and we feel safe. And I thought that was beautiful because I think that a lot of the work I'm assuming the people on this call are doing, or you all are doing, who are working with sponsors and direct sponsors and families, it's so important to recognize how that can provide a real safe haven for someone. Camps and transition points or checkpoints are notoriously dangerous dangerous places for LGBT refugees, because they often require an interrogation or a disclosure of some sort. And for people fleeing persecution because they're gay or lesbian or trans, having to just state that is an outing of your identity to someone who you have no idea if they're going to be safe or not, right? Which is different from saying I'm escaping political persecution, or I'm escaping persecution due to some sort of other identity marker, right? So camps can feel very unsafe. Holding spots can be very unsafe. And for trans people in particular, where their presentation and identity don't conform to maybe the sex marker on their documentation, they can be placed in really, really, really dangerous situation in camps and in holding places. Along the border with Mexico right now, there's just a lot of reports of trans women being put in with men in closed spaces, and also just lack of access to medication that they were already taking for transitioning and so forth. So yeah, so the journey itself is a very scary process. And so when people arrive here, how can we help and how can we connect them to community that will be supportive? Next slide. Challenges to help seeking. So I think this is more of a summary of the information I just shared, but based on that information, I think you can see why someone might have a hard time even just seeking help and support to escape an unsafe environment. The need to self-disclose when there's a lot of fear around that. A lifetime of trauma, fear, stigma, fear of violence also will make someone not want to offer information that further puts them in that place of fear. And then, like, a really huge factor for a lot of us is internalized homophobia and transphobia. When you grow up feeling like this way of being or identifying is wrong or evil or shameful, you start to internalize those feelings from the outside world, and you believe those voices right inside your head. And so there have been many, many studies done on that internalized homophobia and transphobia and the hold it can take on someone. Lack of representation or ability to even imagine another life. If you haven't been exposed to any sort of examples of living freely as an out person, safely as an out person, it's hard to imagine that even exists. And then the mental health impact and the trauma response that comes from that, which can be anything right from feeling frozen or having like decision paralysis or decision fatigue, or just having unhealthy coping mechanisms to cope with the present danger that impact someone's journey to seeking help and changing their circumstance. Next slide. Once folks arrive here, we have challenges in resettlement that are going to be very unique for LGBT refugees. I cited a study here that was done in 2022 by the School of Law with UCLA that actually shares a very similar info to what the Rainbow Railroad report points out. Some different numbers that were shared here. In the US specifically, we had nearly 31,000 self-identified LGBTQI people seeking asylum in this window of time presented here. 4,000 of those reported feeling actual like risk of death if they were returned to their home country. The fear that they cited was not just related to the country, but also within their own communities and families, and sometimes within the family system that they traveled with. For those under 18, just lack of agency, lack of ability to make decisions about their whereabouts and their migration. Again, that fear of needing to out oneself to receive help and support. And then that lack of knowledge and awareness around protections available in other countries and places. So This is an area where I think those of us who are doing work supporting newly arrived refugees, this can inform decisions we're making, right? Like, how do I provide information to youth under 18, separate from maybe when their parents are present, that opens the door to a conversation asking for help or support? Knowing that youth are also at such high risk for suicidality and depression and substance abuse as a coping strategy, how am I presenting resources and information that can be life-saving to someone that is also in a way that they can consume that information outside from their family or community? How are we communicating that safety exists? And maybe it's through written documents, maybe it's through visuals, through posters, through flyers, maybe it's by putting stuff in multiple languages, right? Maybe it's by having imagery that communicates this is a safe place or a safe room for me to have a conversation with you. What are those techniques and strategies that we use that even just open the door for a disclosure where someone doesn't have to do a lot of mental math ahead of time of like, can I even trust this person? Can I even broach the subject here, right? How are we meeting someone at least halfway? Next slide. So we're getting towards the end, and I definitely want to have room for a conversation here. But so what can I do? What can the individual do as a takeaway? I think one of my biggest recommendations is just to take a moment and to maybe take many moments to examine your own assumptions, right? They can be sneaky. I think a lot of assumptions that we have within the refugee and immigrant world is that refugees and immigrants are a mom, a dad crossing the border together, maybe with their children, maybe a grandma or extended family. And we tend to, even visually, when we depict with photos or images, refugees tend to always be sort of this heteronormative family constellation. That's not true of all of us. That doesn't speak to all of us, right? So what are our assumptions? What are my assumptions when I meet someone? You know, what do I think in my head, and how can I pause and resist making assumptions? Using inclusive language, which just means, I think one of the simplest and most common made sort of statements that can be shifted is not addressing someone who looks like a woman, who's a woman presenting person as, and is your husband joining you, right? Again, like you're a caseworker, you're meeting someone, maybe avoid saying like, are you and your husband traveling together, etc. Like language that automatically would shut someone down from disclosing something if that doesn't speak to them. What sort of visuals can signal safety? And I know the rainbow is originated in the US as a pretty Western symbol, but I think at this point, queer LGBT communities throughout the world see the rainbow as a welcoming sign and representative of LGBT identity. And so, what sort of visuals or cues can you put around you to signal that you're a welcoming and inclusive space? And just continuing to educate yourself as an ally if you're outside of the community, and not approaching it as a, okay, one and done. I took a class, I listened on a talk, I'm done, I know what to do, it's all good. Because even for those of us within the community, I feel like there's always new language, there's new information, there's new knowledge and awareness. And so it's good to just have a continuous desire to grow and learn. What can we do as organizations, right? So the next slide is more about what can we do as part of groups or organizations. Reviewing your organizational policies and cultures. What's the language? Is it on the binary? Is it inclusive? Does it even mention LGBT identities? If you're putting together a best practice toolkit for newly arrived Congolese refugees, does it even address the fact that even within Congolese culture, there are LGBT refugees, or there's gender-based violence somebody might have experienced due to their gender or sexuality? Reviewing all of those policies and looking at it from the lens of like, does it even address the fact that LGBT refugees exist? Raising awareness within our staff, right? When we're an organization made of all different people, we can't assume a sort of like same level of knowledge and awareness and understanding, nor should that exist. Like that would be boring. That wouldn't be rich and diverse in itself, right? So, but when it comes to certain topics, how can we bring everyone on board or provide information? Understand your local environment. When we're talking resettlement, it's going to look drastically different from a person coming from Sudan to the Midwest versus to San Francisco or to New York. You know, there are certain states within the US that have much stricter laws that are much less friendly to LGBT people at this time. If you're in a position of helping place someone, consider that. Like, consider what their needs are and consider whether you're putting them in Idaho or California, because there are literal laws that will restrict or provide services to folks in those different states based on what's happening at the local level. So understanding that is really important. And just making it an organizational priority and value to partner with LGBT organizations locally. If you have an intake and you're working with someone, or you're a sponsor group and you're working with someone and you're not equipped to have those conversations or provide those connections, just know where those groups are in your community and make referrals, right? Having that referral process in place, being aware of what those organizations are nationally, locally, and in addition to LGBT organizations, also DV agencies, domestic violence shelters and agencies who work with advocates, in most part, also have a really good understanding of the needs of trans and LGBT individuals, or where to make those connections. Again, because domestic violence and LGBT folks who experience this type of violence at much higher rates, there's a lot of overlap there, right? And so that's another good organization to seek out if you don't know of an LGBT serving community group specifically. And then as my final sort of takeaway here is just, don't render us invisible. We exist, we're everywhere, we're in every country, in every culture, in every organization. And so one of the main things that we can do as people and as organizations is not to just pretend that LGBT people don't exist. And then finally, and I promise to wrap it up so we have time for questions, I wanted to put a link here and to put on your radar survivor-led care, which we pull from the DV world, from the domestic violence and gender-based violence world, in working with people who have been trafficked, who have been exploited, or victims who have experienced sexual assault of some kind. A lot of work has been done on developing philosophy that we call survivor-led care, where we understand that one of the best things we can do when someone has been robbed of control, the most empowering thing we can provide them with is as much agency and control as possible in our interactions. So we are not the expert. They are the expert on their own experience. They know what's best and what's safest. And we, as someone supporting, we walk alongside with, right next to, and we're a guide. We are not the one telling someone what to do, giving advice. We're just providing resources, and we're not taking charge for them, right? We're not approaching it as like, let me take charge for you and tell you to go here or do that, or leave this person, or exit your family, or shun your community, or whatever. It's just about providing support and letting someone feel like they are in charge of their own story and their life and of their own journey through resettlement, and just providing as many resources and options so that someone feels like they have options they didn't have before. And I'll pause here. And again, these slides all have these links. So hopefully if one of these topics you want to get more into, you can just follow them. There are some questions in the chat. Thank you, Tom, for saying that you appreciated this presentation and my speaking on this. And then one question here is, what would you say are the unique strengths LGBTQ refugees bring to our communities? Oh my gosh, I could talk forever about this. I think LGBT people are some of the most vibrant, resilient, joyful, amazing people I know. If you've ever been to like a queer space, into a queer club or a drag show or whatever, you know that it's colorful and it's bright and it's bold. And it speaks to the fact that we have had to exist underground and in hiding for a very long time. And you have to develop a sense of joyful resistance to persist, right? I think that's true for many marginalized communities, but I think there is something about queer joy that's just really wonderful. So when you're working with LGBT refugees, what do they bring to our communities? I think, you know, a life spent making meaning when meaning is constantly being taken away from you, right? When your self-worth is always challenged, finding meaning anyway. That's a beautiful lesson for all of us. And also empathy. I will say that being part of any marginalized community, including the LGBT community, it makes you have greater empathy for others who are struggling with whatever that may be. When, you know, as a person who experiences some type of oppression, I think you start to feel like you can understand that even though someone else's oppression is different from mine, I understand humanity and suffering and pain, and I don't want to see others suffer, right? So that capability for greater empathy, I think, often comes from pain and oppression. I don't know, what would others say who are on this call? Because I'm sure others have thoughts on this. What do we bring to the table as LGBT refugees? It's a job interview. What do you bring to the table?
Everyone, coming on.
Mhm.
I think definitely I love the resilience. I think yeah, there is so much to learn from the fact that you had like many of the LGBTQ IA plus had to hide for a long time, but yet they were still, you know, holding to their identity. And that teaches us all is like, you know, go after it. Don't lose aspect of yourself because of someone who might have a negative view of you because of certain things. But and also like just the fact that also like we're all humans, like we all bring diversity and we bring our intelligence and you know, our passion about different things. That's from my side.
Yeah. Yeah, creativity, color, diversity. I see that in the chat. I think with a bit of time that we have left too, I welcome any questions you have about anything I spoke on today. And also, if you have very specific, you know, challenges or situations that you're working through and you would like guidance on, not necessarily just from me, but from anyone on this call, feel free to ask.
Yeah, we are gonna transition to our Q&A time, but before we
Yes.
do that, because we're gonna stop the recording for the
Yes.
webinar so people can share openly. You can ask any question you want during the Q&A time that we're gonna transition into. We're not gonna have the recording, so feel free to come off mute, to share, to ask any question that you have. Just for now, if you would just take 1 minute to scan this QR code or to follow the link in the chat to give us your feedback. Would love to hear what you think of today's webinar and also what would be other suggestions for future webinars that we have. As you know, we have it monthly. So please take a minute to just provide your feedback. And while you're doing that, I also want to share with you, we have 2 upcoming sounding boards specifically for community sponsorship and engagement staff. One of them is on the topic of approaching challenging conversations in community sponsorship, and the other one is centering diversity, equity, and inclusion in community sponsorship. And we would love for you, if you are a community sponsorship staff or engagement staff, to join these sounding boards. I'm gonna drop the links here right now. And thank you everyone for joining us and attending today's RWC monthly webinar. And again, you will receive a follow-up email from me with a link to the recording and any resources that have been shared. So again, on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.